Welcome, everyone, to the Thursday IRP Seminar Series. We are delighted to have with us today Fernanda Cross, who is an assistant professor at the University of Michigan in the School of Social Work, and she's going to be sharing her work on undocumented Latinx families, and we're thrilled to have her with us. We're going to use our usual format when we're virtual, which is if you have questions or comments, please go ahead and put them in the chat or the Q&A. She's asked to hold substantive questions till the end where there'll be plenty of time for discussion. So if it's something seemingly radically important that I interrupt, I will, but most questions will be held to the end. But type them in as you go so you don't forget what those questions are. With that, again, very excited to hear from Fernanda Cross, assistant professor at the University of Michigan in their School of Social Work. Take it away, Fernanda.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Hi, everyone. I can't see you, but I'm assuming you're there. I'm very excited to be here today talking to you about one of my most recent projects on documentation status socialization among Latinx immigrant families, mixed status families. Today, I'll start out by introducing the topic and going over the literature on the main concepts of interest. I'll talk about some of the main frameworks that we use to guide the study. Next, I'll go over the methods, the results, and I will wrap up by discussing the implications of this work and as well as the future directions of this work. And at the time, I'll be happy to answer all your questions. Okay, so first let me give you a brief overview about undocumented immigration here in the US. Immigrants can have different types of permission to enter and stay in this country, ranging from a temporary stay visa to becoming a naturalized citizen. For example, I am currently a naturalized citizen, but I am an immigrant. I'm from Brazil. So my visa status has changed over the past 20 years since I've came here to the United States. Some immigrants arrive with no permission by crossing the border, while others overstay their original visa. So as you can see in the breakdown here, the breakdown of immigration status for the foreign-born population in the US, we have about 44.7 million foreign-born people in the US, and about 11 million of those are undocumented, which means they don't have the appropriate documentation status to stay in this country and are subject to deportation. It's also important to point out that there are about 4.5 million children ages 17 and under with at least one undocumented immigrant parent, which accounts for about 27% of all children with at least one immigrant parent. And the children of undocumented parents make up 7% of the total US child population. About 3/4 of undocumented immigrants come from Mexico, Central America, and South America. And so given the large number of undocumented immigrants coming from Latin America, undocumented immigration is often perceived as a Latinx issue, which means that many of the issues these immigrants face, including discrimination, impacts all Latinx immigrants regardless of their documentation status. And in fact, Latinx immigrants have suffered the brunt of deportations, with almost all of those deported over the past decades being from Latin America. This targeted enforcement really demonstrates a racialization of undocumented immigration as a Latinx issue, portraying scary brown criminals crossing our border and taking over the jobs of American citizens. Over the last few decades, there has been an increase in restrictive policies targeting Latinx immigrants in the United States that have impacted their access to resources, employment, education, and even the due processing of their asylum application. These immigrants have also experienced higher rates of racial profiling and discrimination, including during a pandemic, which has led to a disproportionate number of COVID-19 cases and deaths in underserved immigrant communities. Even though some may believe that with the change of an administration, there won't be as much discriminatory legislation targeting Latinx immigrants, it's important to remember that Obama was named the Deporter-in-Chief during his administration because he deported more immigrants than any other president. And given the damaging legacy left by Donald Trump and the expected legislative similarities between the Obama and the Biden administration, there remains the great need for a deeper understanding of the experiences of mixed status Latinx families in this country and how these parents prepare their children, prepare their teenagers to navigate a racialized society. And the children of these immigrants are growing up exposed to negative portrayals and stereotypes of their ethnic group. I'm Latinx, I'm an immigrant, I have children. And so we have these conversations. It's part of my job as a parent to counteract these stereotypes and these portrayals that they're seeing from other places, right? And it's through ethnic racial socialization that Latinx immigrant parents provide these important counter narratives to their children, and as well as prepare them for experiences specific to their minority status, which include preparing them to face discrimination, preparing them for prejudice. And ethnic racial socialization has four main dimensions that have been widely studied. Through cultural socialization, parents are teaching their kids about their roots, their language, their traditions, with the goals of developing ethnic pride in the children. And these messages are mainly associated with positive outcomes for Latinx youth. Through preparation for bias, parents are talking to their children about discrimination and preparing them to deal with that, preparing them for future experiences of discrimination themselves. Preparation for bias has been associated with both positive and negative outcomes for children. Through promotion of mistrust, parents are warning their children about intergroup interactions, and these messages have been mostly associated with negative outcomes for Latinx youth. Finally, egalitarianism consists of pretty much avoidance of any race-related discussion and messages, focusing on individual qualities over any ethnic racial group membership. And egalitarianism messages have been found to lead to both positive and negative youth outcomes. As you can imagine, these ethnic racial socialization messages are informed by parents' personal and group experiences, as well as the social context in which they live. So taking into account the previous slides that I just shared, all of these experiences and the social context of the country and of the place where they live are informing these conversations at home. In my study, we focused on documentation status socialization, which we define as the messages and behaviors aimed to teach children about issues related to immigration and documentation status, which constitute an important ethnic racial socialization dimension for Latinx. And through documentation status socialization, parents teach their children about the vulnerability of having undocumented status. They coach them in a way that might reduce their chances of being identified as undocumented, while explaining the benefits afforded to those with documented status. Parents also discuss the risk of deportation, and for the undocumented children, the risk of their own deportation, as well as ways in which the families have prepared to handle these challenges, such as having contingency plans in case of detainment or deportation. So the parents are telling children, if someday you come home and there's no one here, this is what you do, and this is why. So these messages have the goal to comfort the youth, to try to relieve some of their fears regarding family separation, but they're also used to educate the youth about the racialized nature of undocumented immigration, the targeted enforcement of Latinx, and the overall inherent social inequalities associated with being part of a Latinx immigrant family. In my study, we drew on Garcia Cole's and colleagues' integrative model for the study of developmental competencies in minority children as one of the frameworks to guide our study, guide our questions. And in the integrative model, the family unit is viewed as its own sphere of influence that supports and promotes positive development among adolescents. And the model also takes into account how social position factors such as one's race and ethnicity impact the development of youth of color. In the case of Latinx immigrants, especially those living in new immigrant destination, their foreign or undocumented statuses relegates them to the bottom of the social position hierarchy, where they're viewed less positively in comparison to other groups and more likely to experience societal oppression. The model also considers the influence of racism, discrimination, and oppression in the family's lives, including on their ethnic racial socialization practices. In addition, we also drew from the legal violence framework to better understand the convergence of immigration and criminal laws that have been happening in this country over the last years, which allows for societal acceptance of the brutalization against immigrants through their subpar employment opportunities, lack of access to resources, and education opportunities, all resulting in immigrants' own internalization of their place at the bottom of the social position hierarchy, as well as societal compliance with and acceptance of this social position hierarchy that benefits some while continuing oppressing others. So together, these two frameworks were helpful in guiding our understanding of the ethnic racial socialization practices Latinx immigrants use to protect their youth from the sanctioned violence targeting immigrants and its consequences for their families. So again, the main goal of the study was to expand our understanding of the ethnic racial socialization practice of Latinx immigrants to include documentation status socialization as an important socialization dimension for these families. And past studies on the topic have shown differences in socialization practice by documentation status. So for example, undocumented parents have reported asking their children to be more guarded in their behavior and not respond in case of discrimination, while others relied on tools to teach their children about their heritage and traditions that were different from the tools utilized by documented parents. And so these are important within group differences in socialization practices that are not being fully captured by the traditional ethnic racial socialization measures, which then ends up excluding the experiences of millions of individuals. So moving on to the current study, with the goals of exploring the broad spectrum of ethnic racial socialization practices of Latinx immigrants, we conducted in-depth, semi-structured interviews with 39 parents. All interviewees were mothers living in Southeast Michigan. 69% of them were of Mexican origin, 22 of them were undocumented, and 17 were documented. 74% of mothers had a high school diploma or less. Most had been living in the US for about 16 years and were from two-parent households. They all had children that were teenagers between the ages of 14 and 17, and the large majority of the children, 82%, were US born. The interviews inquired about participants' experiences as immigrants raising children in the United States. So I personally conducted all the interviews, which happened at the participants' home. They had the option, this was in 2016, 2017, when we still could do things in person. And so participants could choose the place, they could choose their preferred language for the interview, and 37 chose to be interviewed in Spanish, while 2 preferred English. The interview lasted between 30 and 45 minutes, and the participants received $30 for their time. Now, it's important to provide you some context on the time period in which the interviews were being conducted. It was right around the time when Donald Trump was nominated and during the first few months of his presidency. And this was a time of tremendous vulnerability and fear in the Latinx immigrant community, like pretty much everywhere, but here in Michigan, especially given our closeness to the border. I had to really use all of my years of practice and service with the community to establish rapport and ensure a trustworthy relationship with participants so that they felt comfortable sharing their experiences with me. And with including vulnerable population in research also comes the responsibility with protecting their information. I secured an NIH certificate of confidentiality that prevented the research team from ever having to disclose participants' information. I use an audio an encrypted audio recording device for the interviews, and no identifying information was associated with the data. I was the only one interviewing and having access to the data. And I knew that this was an important step to protect the participants' information. As I was conducting the interviews, I constantly had to straddle this insider and outsider status, because on the one hand, I felt very much like an insider. As I mentioned, I'm a Latinx immigrant, I'm a parent, and I have had to experience my share of discrimination. On the other hand, I had a higher level of education and more economic resources than many of my participants, and I have never been undocumented. So this insider and outsider positionality was unaware. I had to have that awareness as I conducted my interviews and analyzed the data. Also needing to take the steps necessary to check my biases throughout the entire process. The data underwent a rigorous transcription and translation process to ensure that every word was true to its original form. Interviews were analyzed by a team of 7 undergraduate and graduate assistants who all underwent training by me prior to starting the analysis. They were all bilingual, which was very important since we often had to consult the original Spanish transcript for clarification when necessary. I used the radar technique, the rigorous and accelerated data reduction technique for data management, which allows for more intentional analysis through having a series of data reduction phases, where in each iteration, we eliminate data that is not relevant to the research question. And so after each phase, the data gets more concise and more manageable, allowing for a faster analysis process. And so before and during the process, the data analysis team were really immersed themselves in the data, focusing on the content of the messages parents were transmitting to their adolescents regarding immigration and documentation status. Participants reported that talking to their children about the struggles undocumented immigrants face was part of their socialization repertoire. So 2 common sub-themes were identified among both undocumented and documented parents: limitations and restrictions of undocumented status and documentation privilege. So both documented and undocumented parents shared messages that were about these 2 main themes. 3 additional sub-themes pertained only to the undocumented parents. So the documented families did not bring up these topics, only the undocumented. And they were about preparing children for possible parental deportation and family separation, protected by faith, and border crossing as a necessity, not a crime. So both documented and undocumented parents discussed the limitations and restrictions of undocumented status with their teens. Here's a quote from a documented parent. "We do know people who are undocumented, and we have to talk to them meaning their children, about it. But sometimes we find out about what happened to a person who got caught by immigration, or a classmate of my daughter who was in the school over there. So you always hear these kinds of things." And here's a quote from an undocumented parent. "And they would ask why we wouldn't take a trip and why they didn't know their grandparents well. We would always say that we don't have money, we don't have this, we don't have that. But about 2 years ago, they found out the truth, that because no, we can't go." So you can see the difference. In one, for the documented parents, they're talking about the experiences of others. We need to talk to them because eventually they're going to hear about what's going on with families that the parents got caught by immigration. While on the other hand, the parents are talking about, when is it the right moment to share the true vulnerability of our status with our children? And so they're giving examples, like they couldn't travel, like here in Michigan, undocumented immigrants do not have driver's license. So they don't feel safe driving. They don't feel safe traveling. And they can't leave the country because they wouldn't be able to come back. And so talking about these experiences with their children. And another prevalent theme among both documented and undocumented immigrants was about the privilege of having documented status. So documented parents were explaining that their children were aware of the difficulties associated with being undocumented, but they didn't really fully understand the complexities of the issue. So here's a quote from a documented mother who noted that one of her daughters worked with people who didn't speak English, and they probably don't have documents to be in this country. So I talk to her and I tell her about the different ways that people can be in the country with documents or no documents, because I don't think she's aware of that. So these are coworkers. So the participant is talking about having a conversation with her daughter about one of her coworkers who don't speak English, and they're assuming that they're undocumented. Now notice the difference in the conversation between the undocumented mother and her teen. When you're in this country, you have no limits. You can do what you want, and as far as you want. You can be a great doctor, a great lawyer, or a great president. Whatever you want to do in this country, it is available because there are no limits for you. But for us, yes, there are limits. The next three themes that I'm going to talk about were only discussed by undocumented parents who reported having to prepare their children for possible parental deportation and family separation. Daughter, you have to be aware that your father or I can be detained at any moment. It is possible that we're going to be in jail or deported. While another mother explained that after many conversations, her daughter had a better grasp of their situation. She understands now because every time we've heard news of someone who was taken, she comes and she tells me, Mommy, I have a friend. He told me his parents told him that so-and-so was taken away, that someone was taken. Yes, or she saw it on the news, but I tried to not create fear or panic. And so a lot of these participants lived in an area close to Detroit it's very heavily Latinx. So lots of Latinx businesses, and most of the neighbors are Latinx and speak Spanish. And so cars, the vans from ICE, the Immigrant and Customs Enforcement Agency, driving by these neighborhoods are not an uncommon thing. And so these families, these adolescents are often accustomed to seeing the van parked in front of someone's house, stopping someone's car, taking someone who is just walking down the street and stopping and handcuffing them. So these are experiences that are not uncommon to them. Another prevalent theme among undocumented parents was about how their faith helped them keep going despite their fear of deportation. I believe in God. I have the hope and faith in God that everything he, meaning Trump, says, that they won't do it, that what he's talking about, they won't be able to do anything, because it doesn't just affect us. It will affect all of the country, because the country depends a lot on all the immigrants that come here to work, because we didn't come here to harm others. We came here to work. And hear another mother saying they're scared because they say, Mama, what is going to happen to you? I tell them, nothing is going to happen. Nothing is going to happen. In my case, I'm not scared because I grab by the hand of God, and I have always had a lot of faith. And I tell them that nothing is going to happen. Lastly, parents also reported explaining to their kids that despite what they might hear in the news, crossing the border to come to this country in search of work is done out of necessity, not out of choice, which does not make them criminals. The fact that you don't have any papers doesn't mean that you are a criminal, a murderer, or a thief, but it affects us because of the racists and because of the president. And here is another mother's emotional statement. I don't have a record. I'm a good person, a good citizen. So it is illegal to be here, but I haven't committed any crimes. I haven't done anything wrong. So these findings highlight the prevalence of documentation status socialization for Latinx immigrant parents. conversations between parents and children about documentation status, the risks, restrictions, possible outcomes, and who's affected by it were reported by both documented and undocumented participants. However, such conversations were really much more prevalent and urgent for the undocumented group. Parents reported teaching their youth how to navigate our society, given the more frequent and targeted immigration raids that could potentially lead to parental detainment and deportation. And again, they were witnessing these raids. These conversations were also used to explain some of the choices parents make to avoid driving or other activities that might put them at risk. The documentation status, socialization of documented parents was often prompted by the disclosure of the undocumented status of a family member, or in response to children witnessing or hearing about deportations or raids in their community. Often witnessed by children, deportations have become a normal occurrence in many immigrant communities. And these events keep immigrants and their children on high alert, afraid for their families, afraid for their household, afraid for their future. So conversation about documentation status have become more common in the last few years, especially in reactions to remarks often made by Donald Trump. To counteract his negative portrayals, undocumented parents report trying to fostering their children an understanding of what drives immigrants to cross the border. What are the needs? Why are they coming? So that those actions are not perceived as crimes. And parents have also tried to use documentation status socialization to ensure that their children were aware of the privilege they have in being documented. They were aware of the sacrifices the parents have made on their behalf, which were many, many sacrifices. And so these types of conversations are crucial to help children build and maintain pride in their ethnic group, in having pride in their ethnic background, having pride in their immigrant origin, and having pride in all of their parents have done to provide for them. And the findings have implications for schools and practitioners who serve predominant Latinx immigrant communities, because it's important for them to be well informed of unique stressors those community members face in order to provide them with the appropriate resources. For example, if families develop an action plan in case of parental detainment and deportation, the practitioners could provide support to the family by helping the youth follow through with the action plan in case detainment or deportation happens. In addition, community agencies could help train citizens and documented members of immigrant communities on how to advocate on behalf of their undocumented neighbors by spreading awareness of the ongoing fear experienced by many mixed status families, by encouraging people to stand up against xenophobia, and by teaching them how to protect their undocumented neighbors from immigration and custom raids, which actually happened in a city near Nashville in Tennessee. As you can see in the picture at the top, immigration and custom enforcement agents were waiting for the arrival of members of a mixed status families. But their neighbors realized what was at stake. And so what happens was when the family arrived, the neighbors formed a human chain around the family's car to prevent the agents from taking them. And the people stayed there. They formed that chain and they protected the neighbors until the car with the ICE agents left the area and the family could safely get inside their home. So this is something that anyone can do, but they need to know what the issues are, and they need to know what they can do, right? Including the mixed status family members themselves. They often believe that they have no rights, that they that they can't do anything. And in fact, they do have rights. So even just informing them of their rights goes a long way. Some of the limitations of the work include the fact that the majority of participants were of Mexican origin. So our findings may not be applicable to other members of other Latinx groups. So further studies should really try to recruit a more diverse Latinx sample in order to better capture the nuances of documentation status socialization that take place within other Latinx groups. As we know, Latinx is just a broad umbrella term that encompass many different groups, many different countries, many even different languages. So it's important to explore these within group differences. Another important limitation of our work was that we interviewed only mothers. Future studies should aim to include the voice of fathers and other extended family members, but most importantly, the voice of the youth, to really examine the congruence between the documentation status socialization that parents are sharing with how the youth are actually understanding them, as well as learning the impact that these messages are having on the youth. I can say that I've started doing this year, and it has been really, really exciting to hear the perspectives of the youth. Future quantitative studies on ethnic racial socialization should also use more like updated and culturally relevant scales that encompass the experiences of Latinx more broadly, which would allow for researchers to gain a better understanding of the unique experiences of immigrants, including the undocumented individuals and those living in mixed status households. Individuals of Latinx descent are frequently profiled as undocumented, especially those with darker skin. So separating issues of documentation status from those of ethnicity and race within Latinx communities is a complex task. Just as with other ethnic racial socialization practices, talking to children about immigration, documentation status, teaching them about the stigma of being perceived as not having papers or not speaking English is an essential task for Latinx immigrant parents. Whether the parents are documented or not, and I'm speaking by experience here, does documentation status socialization should be included as a meaningful dimension of ethnic racial socialization in future studies, in future scales that are developed, so that it can be further explored and leading to a better understanding of these processes. So that's all I have. I'd like to thank my collaborators, co-authors, lab members, and a special thank you to the project participants for allowing me into their homes and for sharing their experiences with me during a time of such vulnerability in their own lives. It was a true privilege to hear their stories. Thank you.
Thank you, Fernanda. I want to open it up so if folks can please type questions in the chat or the Q&A, we'll get to those. So I'll just start with one. I was wondering if you could tell us more about what you're finding in your adolescent interviews. I know they haven't been completed or fully analyzed yet, but I think it's always the challenge of parents talking about what they think they're doing and then the adolescent's perception of what the parents are doing. So I'd be curious what you're finding with the adolescents.
Yeah, so we have not, this is a pilot data. We are just collecting 15 interviews with parents and 15 interviews with adolescents. We are finding that parents are saying that they're doing one thing and the adolescents are reporting not really having had conversations at that level that the parents are reporting. And so we're trying to get at, the parents are talking about the issues and what are the participants, what are then the children picking up on? What is the main message that they're getting from that? And as you can imagine, I collected this data this year. So a lot of the conversation was focused on COVID and focused on how their lives, being undocumented really further complicated their lives during the pandemic, and how it left them even more isolated. These teenagers already knew that they couldn't disclose the family's documentation status to anyone, but then that really limited how much they felt like they could share with others about anything, because their lives were being so, like, everything was revolving around the difficulties, the parents still having to go to work, not having access to healthcare, not being sure if they could get tested, if they are eligible for the vaccine, if they are eligible for government support. So all of that was really prevalent in their lives over this past year. And so one of the main findings that we got was about the adolescent isolation. And now we're trying to find ways of finding solutions for this. What can we do? It's my job knowing about this, having access to this information to really think about what we could do to give back to the community to support them during this time of such great need.
Yeah. We have another question from Chiara. Were the interview protocols for the documented and the undocumented participants the same or different? And if they were different, how so? And
yeah, great question. They were like almost exactly the same, except that there were like two or three different questions that were specifically for undocumented immigrants. We knew that these families were undocumented because before the interview, they had participated in a survey. And one of the survey questions was about their documentation status or about the documentation status of family members. And so I did not want to have a different protocol specifically because what I learned was oftentimes I would go to interview someone who had said that they were documented in the survey, only to get there. And once the participant felt comfortable with me, they're saying, actually, no, I'm not documented, I'm undocumented. And so I wanted to have, I was interested in this ethnic racial socialization, which I was really not anticipating a lot of difference between the two groups when I went into the project. And then, but I wanted to make sure that I asked pointed questions about how does your documentation status influence this? And once I knew that the participants were undocumented, I would ask specifically about their undocumented experiences. But they're out of like 15 questions, like 12 were the same. Good question. Can I stop sharing my screen? Is that okay?
Sure. You can.
Okay. This way I can see the questions.
The views, right. And so next question, what are some ways you worked around any hesitation by individuals to participate in terms of fear of detention or disclosure of legal status? What were the ways that you worked to build these strong relationships with participants?
Oh, that's a great question. We just had like a 1-hour conversation with the graduate students about this topic, and it's a lot of hard work, a lot of work before. Oh my goodness, I need to connect my computer. My apologies. Okay. Making sure that I made connections with community agencies that the participants chose, that the participants trusted. So forming these connections with the community agencies and talking to them about me, about my work, about my involvement with the community that goes back to 15 years ago when I was an interpreter working with the community. And then my work as a social worker with the undocumented community in Southeast Michigan, and how I have worked in different capacities in different community agencies. And so knowing my connection with the community and what I bring to my research, and I explain all the different levels of protection that I add to my work to make sure that the families are not vulnerable disclosing their information. So like not really collecting personal information, not asking for signed consent forms, recording using an encrypted audio recorder, which if it gets lost or stolen, no one can access the information. And so like all of these different layers of protections, having a certificate of confidentiality, all of that was explained not only to the community agencies, we actually had a community liaison that facilitated our connection with the community, that to explain all of that, but also the fact that I did the interviews and I'm an immigrant, I speak Spanish, so I would go knock on their doors or call them and ask and introduce myself. And oftentimes we did the interviews out on their porch because they did not feel comfortable bringing me inside. And then they would, talking to me, I would talk about myself, about my involvement with the community and what it means to be doing this work. And they would often feel more comfortable talking about their status and talking about their experiences. But it was a process, a long process that to this day, I'm still developing. I'm still making more connections with different communities, with different organizations, and bringing them to the table to actually ask, what should we study? What are you interested? What would benefit the community for us to study? Great question.
We have another question from Lois. Had any of the participants previously been undocumented? And if so, did they share anything about differences in their experiences after they became documented?
Yes, great question. Some participants were indeed, they had been undocumented before. I don't remember exactly the number, but it was like a third of them, of the current documented participants. They had been undocumented and just recently changed their status. And it really, they really brought a much deeper level of connection to the issue and understanding of the issue and how they talk to their kids, because they often could say, they often still had undocumented family members that they could say, oh, your aunt so-and-so and we have to do this on her behalf, or we need to be careful with this because of that. Or remember when I couldn't travel, when I couldn't go back to, whatever their native country with you because I couldn't get out of the country, so they would often talk about their experiences then and their experiences now, but they really brought a much deeper awareness of the issue and like an interest in educating their children about it than the documented participants. Good question.
Yeah, I'll ask another question. So you talked a lot about the feelings, if you will, of fear and concern. I'm wondering if you saw any sort of roots of organization or, political advocacy on their own behalf. I mean, was there a sense of any agency for what could be done or so?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is actually, after having done these interviews, I was interested in how do they, can they feel empowered somehow? And so in my interviews, there was not much discussion about what they could do. However, the participants really try to have a good understanding of the political climate in order to substantiate their reasoning to the children, right? If the political climate is not bad, if there's not really a lot to fear, if we're living comfortably, there are no raids happening, I don't have to expose my children to all of these vulnerabilities. They don't have to live with the anxiety of parental separation. However, if things are different, then I really need to talk to them about it. So after these interviews, we were left wondering, when parents are talking about these things with the children, is there some sort of social political, what kind of social political development is happening throughout this conversation between the children and the parents? Or do the children feel more civically engaged? Do they feel more efficacious? And so we're collecting, it's part of the data that we're collecting now, and we're asking them about that. So I'll have more information. What I've learned is that involvement in an organization that teaches them about their rights, that teaches them about the power of protest, that teaches them about the power of organizing, really makes a difference. Yeah. Understanding the background and understanding what their rights really makes them feel more powerful, that they can do something about it.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, we'll have to have you back to hear about what you learned from the adolescents and the new work.
Yeah, I'll be happy to come back.
And I don't see any more questions, so we'll go ahead and end a little bit early, but thank you so much. This is really great stuff, and we look forward to hearing more about it in the future.
Okay, sounds good. It was great coming here. Thank you so much for having me, and hopefully you have my email. If anyone has any more questions, feel free to contact me.
We will do that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Nice meeting you.